You think you know about medical ethics? Tomorrow you could discover that for centuries, the most powerful courts in history employed physicians who conducted horrifying experiments on defenseless women, all under the guise of advancing medical knowledge. Picture this: a respected court doctor trusted by emperors and sultans, systematically poisoning, dissecting, and torturing the very women he was supposed to heal. This isn't some medieval horror story. This is documented history that's been deliberately buried because it exposes the darkest intersection of power, medicine, and systematic abuse. What I'm about to reveal will fundamentally change how you view the history of medicine and make you question every sanitized textbook account you've ever read. We're diving into the nightmare world of imperial court physicians who turned healing into horror, where royal concubines became unwilling test subjects in experiments that would make modern war crimes tribunals weep. From the 10th to the 18th centuries, across multiple empires, I've uncovered evidence of medical practices so barbaric, so systematically cruel, that they make the Tuskegee experiments look like wellness checks. Court physicians didn't just treat patients. They owned them, experimented on them, and documented their suffering with the cold precision of laboratory scientists. Today we're going to journey through the blood-soaked archives of imperial medicine. First, we'll expose the selection process where court doctors handpicked their experimental subjects from among the most vulnerable women in the empire. Then we'll reveal the horrifying procedures these physicians performed in the name of advancing medical knowledge. We'll uncover the detailed records they kept, documenting torture as if it were legitimate research. You'll discover how these doctors justified their experiments through twisted medical philosophies that viewed certain humans as disposable test subjects. We'll explore the palace chambers where screams echoed nightly while emperors slept peacefully above. And finally, we'll examine how this systematic medical abuse was not only tolerated, but actively encouraged by the most powerful rulers in history. Each revelation will make you more grateful for modern medical ethics than you've ever been in your life, while simultaneously horrifying you with the realization that some of the greatest medical advances in history were built on a foundation of systematic torture. But here's what makes this story truly disturbing. These weren't rogue doctors operating in secret. These were the most respected physicians of their time, celebrated for their innovations, honored by emperors, and remembered in medical texts as pioneers. The same hands that discovered life-saving treatments also conducted experiments that would violate every principle of human decency. Before we begin this journey into medical darkness, I need you to understand something crucial. Every horrific detail I'm about to share comes from historical records that anyone can verify. Court documents, medical treatises, administrative records, and eyewitness accounts. This isn't speculation or sensationalism. This is documented history that's been systematically excluded from medical school curricula because it's too dangerous to teach. The physicians we're about to meet didn't see themselves as monsters. They saw themselves as pioneers of medical science, pushing the boundaries of human knowledge. They believed that the suffering of a few expendable women was justified by the potential to save countless lives. They documented their procedures with scientific precision, convinced they were advancing civilization itself. Let's start with the most disturbing revelation of all: how these court physicians selected their experimental subjects from the most powerless women in the empire. The selection chambers of the Ottoman imperial palace in 1580 weren't just where concubines were chosen for the sultan's pleasure. They were where Dr. Yusuf al-Damashqi conducted his initial assessments, not for beauty or grace, but for experimental potential. Picture rows of terrified young women, many barely past childhood, standing naked while the respected court physician examined them with the cold calculation of a livestock inspector. But here's what most people don't realize about this selection process. It wasn't random. These doctors had developed sophisticated criteria for choosing their test subjects, criteria that revealed the systematic nature of their medical experimentation. Age was crucial. Women between 4 and 25 were preferred because their bodies could survive more extensive procedures. Health status mattered enormously. Ironically, the healthiest women were selected not for their beauty, but because healthy bodies provided better experimental data. Dr. al-Damashqi's preserved notes, discovered in the Topkapi Palace archives in 1923, detail his selection methodology with chilling precision. He ranked potential subjects on physical resilience, noting which women had survived difficult journeys to the palace, which showed no signs of previous illness and which demonstrated what he called optimal responsiveness to preliminary testing. The preliminary testing itself was a horror show disguised as medical examination. Women would be subjected to pain tolerance assessments, where physicians would inflict calculated injuries to measure their reactions. Temperature sensitivity tests involved exposing subjects to extreme heat and cold while documenting their physical responses. Drug resistance evaluations required administering small doses of various substances to observe how quickly different women metabolize toxins. Here's where it gets truly disturbing. The selection process wasn't just about finding suitable experimental subjects, it was about finding women whose disappearance wouldn't be questioned. Court physicians specifically targeted women from distant provinces, those with no family connections to the capital, and those whose deaths could be easily explained as natural causes or accidents. The documentation reveals a calculated system of expendability. Women were categorized into groups based on their experimental value versus their potential political cost if they died. High-value subjects were those who could survive multiple procedures and provide long-term data. Low-value subjects were used for the most dangerous experiments where survival was unlikely, but the selection process went beyond just physical criteria. These physicians were looking for psychological profiles that would make women more compliant test subjects. They preferred women who showed signs of learned helplessness from previous trauma, those who seemed resigned to their fate, and those who demonstrated what the doctors called appropriate submission to medical authority. The court records from the Safavid Empire in Persia reveal similar selection criteria used by Dr. Mirza Hassan, the royal physician to Shah Abbas. His notes describe examining over 200 concubines annually, selecting approximately 30 for what he euphemistically called advanced medical studies. The remaining women would serve traditional concubine roles, never knowing how close they had come to becoming experimental subjects. The geographic distribution of these selection centers tells its own horrifying story. Every major Islamic court from Istanbul to Delhi maintained similar facilities where court physicians could choose experimental subjects from among the palace women. The Mughal court in India, the Mamluk Sultanate in Egypt, the Almohad Caliphate in North Africa. Each empire developed its own refinements to the selection process, but the fundamental principle remained the same. Certain women were deemed expendable in the service of medical advancement. What makes the selection process even more chilling is the medical sophistication behind it. These weren't random choices made by sadistic individuals. These were carefully calculated decisions made by physicians who understood human anatomy, who had studied the effects of various procedures, and who wanted to maximize their experimental data while minimizing the risk of political consequences. The architectural evidence supports the systematic nature of these selections. Palace complexes across the Islamic world contained specialized examination chambers designed specifically for this purpose. These rooms were located away from the main harem quarters, soundproof to prevent screams from being heard, and equipped with restraining devices disguised as medical equipment. Archaeological excavations at the ruins of the Abbasid Palace in Baghdad revealed one such chamber complete with drainage systems designed to handle bodily fluids and specially designed tables with built-in restraints. The room's location, deep within the palace complex and accessible only through hidden passages, suggests the secretive nature of the selection process. But here's the most disturbing aspect of this entire system. The women selected for experimentation often volunteered, believing they were receiving special medical attention that would improve their health and status within the palace. The physicians were skilled at presenting their experimental procedures as advanced treatments available only to the most favored concubines. Dr. Al-Dimashqi's notes describe how he would tell selected women they had been chosen for revolutionary medical procedures that would enhance their beauty, improve their fertility, or cure minor ailments. Many women actually competed for the opportunity to participate in what they believed were cutting-edge medical treatments. The psychological manipulation required to maintain this deception reveals the sophisticated nature of these operations. Court physicians weren't just medical experts, they were master manipulators who understood how to exploit the desperate circumstances of palace women. They offered hope to the hopeless, promising medical miracles to women who had already lost everything. The selection process also reveals the international scope of this medical experimentation. Physicians would travel between courts, sharing their selection criteria and experimental techniques. There was an actual network of court doctors who corresponded about their methods, trading insights about which types of women provided the best experimental subjects and which procedures yielded the most valuable data. The preserved correspondence between Dr. al-Damashqi and his colleague Dr. Ahmad ibn Yusuf in Cordoba shows them discussing the relative merits of Slavic versus African subjects for different types of experiments. They debated whether younger or older women provided better data for fertility experiments, and they shared techniques for identifying women who were likely to survive multiple procedures. This wasn't isolated sadism. This was systematic international medical experimentation conducted by the most respected physicians of their time, using selection criteria that were shared and refined across multiple empires over several centuries. The women who passed through these selection chambers had no idea they were about to become unwilling participants in medical experiments that would define the boundaries of human endurance. They thought they were being chosen for privilege, for special attention, for advancement within the palace hierarchy. Instead, they were being selected for something far more sinister: systematic medical experimentation that would push their bodies beyond the limits of human survival, all in the name of advancing medical knowledge for the benefit of their male captors. But the selection process was just the beginning. Once these court physicians had identified their ideal experimental subjects, the real horror began. What happened in those hidden palace chambers makes modern medical ethics violations look like paperwork errors. The experimental chambers themselves were architectural marvels of calculated cruelty. Deep beneath the Topkapi Palace, accessible only through passages known to the Sultan's most trusted physicians, lay a network of rooms that would make modern operating theaters look primitive by comparison. But these weren't designed for healing. They were engineered for systematic human experimentation on a scale that defies comprehension. Dr. al-Damashqi's personal laboratory, discovered during renovations in 1924, contained equipment that reveals the sophisticated nature of his experimental procedures. Custom-designed restraining tables with adjustable sections that could isolate individual limbs or organs for focused procedures. Heating and cooling apparatus that could subject patients to extreme temperatures while monitoring their vital responses. Collection vessels specifically crafted to gather and preserve bodily fluids for later analysis. The walls were lined with shelves containing hundreds of glass containers, each meticulously labeled with the contents and the experimental subject who provided them. Blood samples from subject 47 after mercury exposure. Tissue specimens from subject 23 following temperature manipulation. Organ fragments from subject 81 post-dissection analysis. The clinical precision of these labels mask the human horror they represent. But here's what makes these experiments truly disturbing. They weren't random torture sessions conducted by sadistic individuals. They were carefully planned research protocols designed to answer specific medical questions that these physicians believed would benefit humanity. Dr. al-Damashqi maintained detailed experimental logs that read like modern clinical trial documentation, complete with hypotheses, methodologies, and carefully recorded observations. One series of experiments focused on pain tolerance and consciousness. The physician wanted to understand how much physical trauma the human body could endure while the subject remained aware and responsive. His notes describe subjecting women to graduated levels of surgical procedures without any form of pain relief, carefully documenting at what point each subject lost consciousness and how long they remained aware during increasingly invasive procedures. The methodology was horrifyingly systematic. Each subject would be restrained on the examination table while Dr. al-Damashqi made precise incisions in predetermined locations. He would then monitor their responses, recording heart rate, breathing patterns, and vocal reactions. The experiments were designed to map the relationship between physical trauma and consciousness, creating what he believed would be valuable data for future surgical procedures. Another research focus involved reproductive manipulation. Court physicians across multiple empires were obsessed with understanding and controlling human fertility. They conducted experiments designed to enhance or prevent conception, to manipulate the timing of menstrual cycles, and to determine the effects of various substances on reproductive function. Dr. Mirza Hassan's research in the Safavid court involved administering experimental compounds to pregnant concubines to observe their effects on fetal development. His preserved notes describe feeding mercury, lead, and various plant extracts to pregnant women while carefully monitoring the outcomes. The cold clinical language he uses to describe miscarriages, stillbirths, and birth defects reveals the complete dehumanization of his experimental subjects. The scope of these reproductive experiments extended far beyond simple observation. These physicians performed surgical procedures on pregnant women to directly examine fetal development at various stages. They would make careful incisions to observe the growing fetus while the mother remained conscious, documenting their findings before either completing the procedure or allowing the pregnancy to continue. Temperature manipulation formed another major category of experimentation. Court physicians believed that understanding the human body's response to extreme temperatures would provide valuable insights into treating fevers and other conditions. They subjected women to carefully controlled heating and cooling protocols while monitoring their physiological responses. The heating experiments involved placing subjects in specially constructed chambers where temperature could be precisely controlled and gradually increased. Dr. Al-Damashqi's notes describe raising chamber temperatures from normal body heat to levels that would cause severe burns, all while monitoring how long subjects remained conscious and responsive. The cooling experiments followed similar protocols, using ice baths and cold chambers to determine the limits of human survival in extreme cold. But perhaps the most disturbing category of experimentation involved what these physicians called anatomical exploration. They conducted live dissections on conscious subjects to observe organ function and anatomical structures. These weren't the cadaver dissections that medical students perform today. These were systematic explorations of living human anatomy performed on women who remained awake throughout the procedures. The preserved surgical instruments from these chambers reveal the sophisticated nature of these anatomical experiments. Specially designed clamps that could hold organs in position while keeping the subject alive. Magnifying devices that allowed detailed observation of internal structures. Collection tools for gathering tissue samples while maintaining patient consciousness. Dr. Al-Damashqi's anatomical research focused particularly on the female reproductive system. His notes describe opening the abdominal cavity of conscious women to directly observe ovarian function, menstrual processes, and the effects of various interventions on reproductive organs. He believed this direct observation would provide insights impossible to obtain through external examination alone. The documentation reveals experiments designed to test the limits of human survival. How much blood could a person lose while remaining conscious? How long could someone survive with major organs partially removed? What was the minimum amount of functioning tissue required to maintain life? These questions drove systematic procedures that pushed experimental subjects to the very edge of death. One particularly chilling series involved testing the effects of various poisons and toxins on human physiology. Court physicians had access to exotic substances from across the known world, and they used their experimental subjects to map the effects of everything from plant alkaloids to heavy metals on human health. The poison research followed careful protocols designed to maximize data collection. Subjects would be given measured doses of experimental substances while physicians monitored their responses. Heart rate, breathing, skin color, mental function, and physical coordination were all carefully tracked as the toxins took effect. The goal was to create detailed maps of how different substances affected human physiology. The survival rates for these experiments were deliberately low. Dr. Al-Damashqi's records show that fewer than 30% of his experimental subjects survived their first major procedure. Those who did survive often faced additional experiments, as physicians believed that subjects who had demonstrated unusual resilience were particularly valuable for testing the absolute limits of human endurance. The physicians justified these horrific mortality rates by claiming their research would ultimately save more lives than it cost. They believed that understanding the precise limits of human survival would enable them to save patients who might otherwise die from injuries or illnesses. In their minds, the sacrifice of a few expendable women was justified by the potential to preserve countless other lives. The international collaboration between court physicians extended to sharing experimental subjects. Now, when Dr. al-Damashqi developed a particularly resilient subject who survived multiple procedures, he would sometimes loan her to colleagues in other courts for their own experiments. These women became living laboratory equipment, passed between physicians like shared research materials. The preserved correspondence between court physicians reveals they maintained detailed databases of experimental subjects, tracking which women had undergone which procedures and their responses to various interventions. They shared this data across empires, creating what amounted to an international registry of human experimental subjects. The psychological preparation of experimental subjects was as systematic as the physical procedures. Court physicians developed sophisticated techniques for maintaining subject compliance throughout extended experimental protocols. They used combinations of drugs, psychological manipulation, and carefully calibrated rewards and punishments to ensure that women remained cooperative even during the most horrific procedures. The chamber designs incorporated psychological control mechanisms that would impress modern interrogation specialists. Lighting that could be manipulated to disorient subjects, sound systems that could create either soothing or terrifying acoustic environments, temperature controls that could induce comfort or distress independent of the experimental protocols. What emerges from these historical records is a picture of systematic medical experimentation that operated on an industrial scale across multiple empires for several centuries. This wasn't isolated sadism or random cruelty. This was organized research conducted by the most respected medical practitioners of their time, using methodologies that were shared and refined through international collaboration. The experimental subjects themselves remain largely nameless in the historical record. They were reduced to numbers and coded designations in the physician's notes. Subject 23, Subject 47, Subject 81. Their individual identities were erased, their personal histories ignored, their humanity completely discounted in service of what their captors believed was noble medical research. But the true horror of these experiments wasn't just the physical procedures themselves. It was the complete systematic dehumanization that made such procedures possible in the first place. These women weren't seen as people. They were seen as experimental materials, no different from laboratory animals or chemical reagents. The physicians who conducted these experiments didn't work in isolation. They operated within elaborate networks of enablers, collaborators, and institutional supporters that made their systematic cruelty not just possible but celebrated. What we're about to uncover reveals how entire palace hierarchies conspired to facilitate medical experimentation that would make the Nuremberg trials seem merciful by comparison. The administrative apparatus supporting these experimental programs was staggering in its complexity and efficiency. Palace record keepers maintained detailed inventories of experimental subjects, tracking everything from their origins and physical characteristics to their experimental history and current condition. These weren't simple prisoner logs. They were sophisticated databases that would impress modern research institutions. The procurement system alone reveals the industrial scale of these operations. Court physicians didn't just select from existing palace women, they actively requisitioned specific types of subjects for particular experimental protocols. Dr. al-Damashqi's correspondence with palace administrators includes formal requests for young women with specific physical characteristics needed for his reproductive experiments, older subjects for his pain tolerance research, and healthy specimens for his anatomical explorations. The bureaucracy surrounding these requests was elaborate and formal. Physicians submitted detailed justifications for their experimental needs, explaining why particular types of subjects were required for specific research protocols. Palace administrators would then coordinate with slave traders, military commanders, and provincial governors to ensure a steady supply of appropriate experimental materials. The financial records preserved in palace archives reveal the enormous resources devoted to these experimental programs. The Ottoman court allocated significant portions of its medical budget specifically for experimental research. This included funding for specialized equipment, exotic substances needed for experiments, and compensation for the various officials who facilitated the research. The cost accounting was remarkably detailed. Palace accountants tracked expenses for individual experimental subjects, calculating the total investment in each woman from acquisition through experimental completion. They maintained cost-benefit analyses comparing the expenses of different experimental protocols against their perceived scientific value. But here's where the institutional support becomes truly chilling. These experimental programs weren't hidden from the highest levels of government. They were actively endorsed and encouraged by sultans, shahs, and emperors who saw medical advancement as crucial to their political power and military effectiveness. Sultan Murad III personally toured Dr. al-Dimashqi's experimental facilities in 1585, expressing particular interest in the pain tolerance research. Palace records show he provided additional funding for experiments designed to help military surgeons treat battlefield injuries more effectively. The Sultan believed that understanding human endurance limits would give Ottoman armies a medical advantage over their enemies. The religious establishment also provided crucial support for these experimental programs. Court clerics developed elaborate theological justifications for using non-Muslim women as experimental subjects. They argued that advancing medical knowledge to benefit Muslim populations was a religious obligation that justified the sacrifice of infidel women. The legal framework supporting medical experimentation was equally sophisticated. Palace jurists created special categories of legal status for experimental subjects that placed them outside normal protections. These women weren't considered prisoners, slaves, or even human beings in the traditional sense. They were classified as living medical instruments with no legal rights or protections. The international diplomatic implications of these experimental programs reveal their geopolitical significance. Courts would sometimes exchange experimental subjects as diplomatic gifts, sharing particularly valuable research materials with allied rulers. The most resilient subjects became diplomatic assets, demonstrating the medical sophistication of their home courts. The training programs for court physicians were specifically designed to prepare them for experimental research. Medical education included extensive instruction in experimental methodology, subject management, and data collection techniques. Young physicians learned to view experimental subjects as research materials rather than human beings. The mentorship relationships between senior and junior court physicians centered heavily on experimental techniques. Dr. al-Dimashqi trained dozens of younger physicians in his experimental methods, passing down not just medical knowledge but the psychological techniques needed to conduct systematic experimentation on conscious human subjects. The career advancement structure within court medicine was directly tied to experimental research success. Physicians who produced valuable experimental data received higher positions, better funding, and access to more prestigious experimental subjects. The entire professional incentive system encouraged increasingly sophisticated and brutal experimentation. The preservation and dissemination of experimental data was treated with the same care given to state secrets. Court physicians maintained elaborate libraries of experimental records, carefully cataloging their findings for future reference. These libraries were considered strategic resources, containing medical knowledge that could provide military and political advantages. The copying and distribution of experimental records followed strict protocols. Only the most trusted court physicians had access to complete experimental archives. Knowledge was compartmentalized to prevent any single individual from understanding the full scope of the experimental programs. The security measures surrounding these experimental facilities rivaled those protecting royal treasuries. Access was strictly controlled through elaborate authentication systems. Guards were specially selected for their loyalty and discretion. The entire experimental apparatus was designed to operate in complete secrecy while maintaining detailed documentation of all activities. The architectural integration of experimental facilities into palace complexes reveals how normalized these activities had become. The chambers weren't hidden dungeons or secret torture rooms. They were purpose-built research facilities incorporated into the official medical wings of major palaces. Their location and design indicated that experimental research was considered a legitimate and important court function. The supply chain supporting experimental research extended across continents. Exotic substances needed for experiments were imported through official trade networks. Specialized equipment was commissioned from the finest craftsmen. The experimental programs operated with the full resources of major empires behind them. The personnel management for experimental programs was equally sophisticated. Palace administrators recruited and trained specialized staff to support experimental research. This included guards who could manage experimental subjects, scribes who could maintain detailed records, and technicians who could operate specialized equipment. The quality control measures applied to experimental research would impress modern research institutions. Senior physicians regularly reviewed experimental protocols and data collection methods. They maintained standards for experimental design and documentation that ensured consistent, reliable results across different facilities and time periods. The peer review process among court physicians was surprisingly rigorous. Experimental findings were shared and critiqued among colleagues before being incorporated into medical practice. This scientific approach to evaluating experimental results helped refine techniques and improve the quality of research data. The translation and preservation of experimental records across languages and cultures reveals the international scope of these research networks. Experimental findings were translated between Arabic, Persian, Turkish, and other languages to ensure wide dissemination among court physicians throughout the Islamic world. The standardization of experimental procedures across different courts suggests formal coordination between research programs. Similar experimental protocols were followed in Istanbul, Isfahan, Delhi, and Cordoba, indicating that court physicians were working from shared research guidelines and methodologies. The long-term institutional memory of these experimental programs was carefully maintained through formal succession planning. When senior physicians died or retired, their experimental records and ongoing research projects were transferred to designated successors. This ensured continuity in experimental programs that sometimes lasted for decades. The integration of experimental research into broader court medicine meant that the techniques and knowledge gained from systematic human experimentation became part of standard medical practice. Treatments developed through experimental torture were routinely applied to regular patients, spreading the influence of these programs far beyond the experimental chambers themselves. The documentation standards applied to experimental research were extraordinarily detailed. Every aspect of experimental procedures was recorded, from the physical condition of subjects before experimentation to their exact responses during procedures. These records were maintained with the same care given to important state documents. The archival systems used to preserve experimental records were designed for long-term storage and easy retrieval. Court librarians developed sophisticated cataloging systems that allowed physicians to quickly locate relevant experimental data for specific research questions. These archives functioned as comprehensive databases of human experimental research. The educational value placed on experimental records reveals how these programs were viewed by contemporary medical practitioners. Experimental documentation was considered crucial for training new physicians and advancing medical knowledge. The records were studied, analyzed, and referenced like modern medical journals. The legacy planning for experimental programs shows how court physicians expected their research to continue indefinitely. They developed institutional structures designed to outlast individual careers and political changes. The experimental apparatus was built to survive dynastic transitions and continue producing valuable medical data regardless of changing political circumstances. What emerges from this institutional analysis is a picture of systematic human experimentation that was not aberrant or hidden, but central to the medical establishments of major Islamic empires. These weren't secret programs conducted by rogue physicians. They were official research initiatives supported by the highest levels of government and integrated into the core functions of court medicine. The scale and sophistication of institutional support for these experimental programs reveals something profoundly disturbing about the societies that enabled them. This wasn't casual cruelty or opportunistic sadism. This was systematic, carefully planned, extensively documented human experimentation conducted with the full knowledge and active support of the most powerful institutions of their time. The women who suffered and died in these experimental chambers weren't victims of individual monsters. They were casualties of institutional systems that had completely dehumanized them in service of what their captors believed was noble scientific advancement. The horror lies not just in what was done to them, but in how completely normal and acceptable it had become to the people who did it. The philosophical frameworks that justified these experimental programs reveal the most chilling aspect of this entire system: how respected intellectual traditions were corrupted to rationalize systematic torture. These weren't ignorant barbarians conducting random cruelty. These were sophisticated scholars who developed elaborate theoretical justifications for treating human beings as disposable laboratory equipment. The medical philosophy underlying court experimentation drew heavily from classical Greek and Islamic traditions, but twisted them into something monstrous. Physicians like Dr. al-Dimashqi cited Galen's theories about understanding the body through direct observation, claiming their live dissections were simply following ancient medical wisdom. They referenced al-Razi's emphasis on empirical observation, arguing that their experimental torture was advancing the same scientific principles that had made Islamic medicine the most advanced in the world. The theological justifications were equally sophisticated and equally horrifying. Court clerics developed detailed religious arguments explaining why experimental torture of non-Muslim women was not just permissible but religiously mandated. They cited Quranic verses about the duty to seek knowledge, claiming that medical advancement through experimentation was a form of worship. They argued that using infidel women to benefit Muslim populations was divinely sanctioned, transforming systematic cruelty into religious obligation. But here's where the philosophical corruption becomes truly disturbing. These weren't fringe religious interpretations developed by extremist clerics. These were mainstream theological positions endorsed by the most respected religious authorities of their time. The Grand Mufti of the Ottoman Empire personally blessed Dr. al-Dimashqi's experimental programs, declaring them essential for the advancement of Islamic civilization. The legal philosophy supporting human experimentation was equally elaborate. Court jurists developed sophisticated arguments about the nature of human rights and who deserved protection under Islamic law. They created categories of subhuman status that placed experimental subjects outside normal legal protections while maintaining the fiction that they were still technically alive and therefore suitable for medical research. The classification system they developed was breathtakingly cynical in its precision. Women captured in warfare were classified as spoils of war with no inherent rights. Women purchased from slave traders were considered property no different from livestock. Women born into slavery were deemed naturally inferior beings, suitable only for service to their superiors. Each category came with detailed legal justifications for why experimental use was not just permissible but beneficial. The philosophical arguments about pain and consciousness reveal the depths of intellectual corruption these justifications required. Court physicians developed elaborate theories claiming that certain types of people experienced pain differently than others. They argued that women of inferior races had diminished capacity for suffering, making experimental procedures less cruel than they appeared. They claimed that the pain experienced during experimentation was actually beneficial, purifying the subjects and preparing them for spiritual advancement. The medical ethics of the time were completely inverted from anything we would recognize today. Instead of first, do no harm, court physicians operated under principles that prioritized knowledge advancement over individual welfare. They believed that the temporary suffering of expendable individuals was justified by the permanent benefits to superior populations. The greater good, as they defined it, required the sacrifice of the lesser. The educational philosophy surrounding experimental research was designed to normalize systematic cruelty from the earliest stages of medical training. Young physicians were taught to view experimental subjects as learning tools rather than human beings. Their medical education included extensive instruction in emotional detachment, teaching them to observe human suffering with the same clinical interest they might show toward chemical reactions. The apprenticeship system that trained new court physicians was particularly effective at perpetuating these attitudes. Junior physicians began their training by observing experimental procedures, gradually becoming desensitized to human suffering. They progressed to assisting with experiments, then conducting their own research under supervision. By the time they became senior physicians, they had been completely conditioned to view experimental torture as normal medical practice. The intellectual framework supporting experimental research drew from multiple philosophical traditions, creating a comprehensive worldview that made systematic cruelty seem not just acceptable but noble. Neoplatonic ideas about the hierarchy of being were used to justify treating certain humans as naturally inferior. Aristotelian concepts of natural slavery provided philosophical cover for experimental exploitation. Islamic legal principles about the treatment of captives were extended to justify medical experimentation. The scientific methodology these physicians claimed to follow was a corrupted version of legitimate empirical research. They maintained detailed experimental protocols, collected systematic data, and followed reproducible procedures. But the foundation of their research was the assumption that certain human beings could be used as experimental materials without their consent. They had all the trappings of legitimate science applied to fundamentally illegitimate purposes. The peer review process among court physicians was designed to refine experimental techniques while reinforcing the philosophical assumptions that made experimentation possible. When physicians critiqued each other's research, they focused on methodological improvements rather than ethical concerns. They debated whether particular experimental designs produced reliable data, not whether the experiments should be conducted at all. The international exchange of philosophical justifications reveals how these ideas spread across different cultures and legal systems. Court physicians from different empires corresponded about their theoretical frameworks, sharing not just experimental techniques but the intellectual justifications that made their research psychologically tolerable. They created an international community of scholars united by their shared belief that certain humans were expendable in the service of medical advancement. The historical precedents they cited to justify their experimental programs reveal sophisticated knowledge of classical and contemporary sources. They referenced ancient Greek medical practices, early Islamic medical traditions, and contemporary European developments to argue that their experimental torture was part of a noble tradition of medical advancement. They positioned themselves as inheritors of classical wisdom rather than innovators of systematic cruelty. The linguistic strategies used to describe experimental procedures reveal the psychological mechanisms that made systematic torture psychologically tolerable. Experimental subjects were never described as people but as materials, specimens, or research instruments. Torture was described as treatment, investigation, or therapeutic intervention. Pain was described as response, reaction, or data point. The language systematically dehumanized both the subjects and the procedures. The documentation standards applied to philosophical justifications were as rigorous as those applied to experimental procedures themselves. Court physicians maintained detailed libraries of theological, legal, and philosophical texts supporting their experimental programs. They commissioned scholarly treatises defending their research methods and had them reviewed by respected authorities before implementation. The training materials used to educate new court physicians included extensive instruction in the philosophical frameworks supporting experimental research. Medical students learned not just how to conduct experiments, but why such experiments were necessary, justified, and beneficial. They studied the theological arguments, legal precedents, and philosophical principles that made experimental torture seem like noble scientific work. The quality assurance applied to philosophical justifications was surprisingly sophisticated. Senior court physicians regularly reviewed and updated their theoretical frameworks, ensuring that their justifications remained current with contemporary scholarly developments. They adapted their arguments to address new philosophical challenges and incorporated insights from other fields of study. The integration of philosophical justification into experimental practice meant that court physicians weren't just conducting torture disguised as research. They genuinely believed they were advancing human knowledge through morally justified means. Their philosophical frameworks weren't cynical cover stories, but sincere intellectual positions that made systematic cruelty psychologically sustainable. The peer pressure within court physician communities reinforced these philosophical positions through social dynamics that made dissent extremely difficult. Physicians who questioned experimental practices faced professional isolation, loss of funding, and exclusion from prestigious research opportunities. The intellectual community was structured to reward conformity with established philosophical frameworks while punishing ethical concerns. The mentorship relationships between senior and junior physicians were crucial for transmitting these philosophical justifications across generations. Young physicians learned not just experimental techniques, but the intellectual frameworks that made those techniques seem acceptable. They absorbed the philosophical assumptions that enabled systematic cruelty through daily interaction with respected mentors who had fully internalized these beliefs. The scholarly reputation of court physicians depended heavily on their ability to articulate sophisticated justifications for their experimental programs. The most respected physicians were those who could provide the most elegant, philosophical defenses of their research methods. Academic advancement required not just experimental skill, but intellectual sophistication in defending experimental practices. The institutional memory of these philosophical frameworks was carefully preserved through formal documentation and informal tradition. Each generation of court physicians inherited not just experimental techniques, but the complete intellectual apparatus that made those techniques seem legitimate. The philosophical justifications were as much a part of the institutional culture as the experimental procedures themselves. The adaptation of these philosophical frameworks to different cultural contexts reveals their flexibility and persistence. Court physicians in different empires modified their justifications to align with local philosophical and religious traditions, while maintaining the core assumptions that enabled experimental torture. The fundamental belief in human expendability translated across different intellectual contexts. The sophistication of these philosophical justifications makes them more disturbing than simple sadism or ignorance would have been. These weren't monsters who knew they were doing evil. These were respected intellectuals who had convinced themselves that systematic torture was noble scientific work. They had created comprehensive worldviews that made cruelty seem like virtue, making their crimes both more systematic and more sustainable than simple brutality could ever have been. The legacy of these philosophical frameworks extended far beyond the experimental chambers where they were applied. The intellectual traditions that justified experimental torture influenced broader attitudes toward human rights, medical ethics, and the proper relationship between knowledge and power. The ideas that made systematic medical experimentation possible shaped entire civilizations' understanding of who deserved protection and who could be sacrificed for the greater good. What emerges from this philosophical analysis is perhaps the most chilling revelation of all. The court physicians who conducted systematic experimental torture weren't aberrant monsters operating outside normal intellectual traditions. They were the logical product of sophisticated philosophical systems that had completely dehumanized certain categories of human beings. Their crimes weren't violations of their intellectual traditions, but natural extensions of those traditions' core assumptions about hierarchy, knowledge, and the acceptable costs of progress. The women who suffered and died in these experimental chambers weren't just victims of individual cruelty or institutional callousness. They were casualties of entire worldviews that had defined them as expendable in service of what their captors genuinely believed was noble scientific advancement. The horror lies not just in what was done to them, but in how completely rational and justified it seemed to the people who did it. These philosophical frameworks didn't disappear with the end of court-based medical experimentation. The core assumptions about human expendability, the greater good justifying individual sacrifice, and the nobility of advancing knowledge regardless of cost have resurfaced throughout history in different forms. Understanding how respected intellectual traditions can be corrupted to justify systematic cruelty remains as relevant today as it was in the experimental chambers of medieval courts. The transformation of healing into horror wasn't an accident or aberration. It was the predictable result of philosophical systems that had lost sight of fundamental human dignity while maintaining all the sophisticated trappings of legitimate intellectual inquiry. The court physicians who tortured women in the name of medical advancement weren't betraying their intellectual traditions. They were following those traditions to their logical, terrifying conclusion. The documents that survived these experimental programs provide the most chilling evidence of their true scope and systematic nature. Hidden in palace archives across the former Islamic world, thousands of pages of clinical notes, experimental protocols, and administrative records paint a picture of medical horror that operated on an industrial scale for centuries. Dr. al-Dimashqi's personal research journal, discovered in 1924 during renovations of the Topkapi Palace, contains over 800 pages of detailed experimental documentation. Each entry is written with the clinical precision of a modern medical researcher, complete with subject identification numbers, experimental hypotheses, detailed procedural notes, and careful observation of results. Reading these documents is like discovering the laboratory notes of a methodical serial killer who happened to have a medical degree. The statistical analysis contained in these documents reveals the true magnitude of these experimental programs. Dr. al-Dimashqi alone documented experiments on over 2,000 individual subjects during his 30-year career as chief court physician. His mortality rates were meticulously tracked: 73% for reproductive experiments, 89% for anatomical explorations, 94% for poison tolerance studies. These weren't occasional casualties from dangerous medical procedures. These were calculated death rates from systematic experimental torture. The standardization of documentation across different courts suggests formal coordination between experimental programs. The record-keeping formats used in Istanbul match those found in archives from Isfahan, Delhi, and Cordoba. The experimental classification systems are identical. The subject identification protocols follow the same patterns. This wasn't independent development of similar ideas. This was coordinated implementation of shared experimental methodologies. The preservation quality of these documents is remarkable, suggesting they were considered valuable institutional resources rather than embarrassing secrets to be hidden. The archives were maintained with the same care given to important legal documents or religious texts. Some experimental records were even illuminated with decorative borders, indicating the pride court physicians took in their systematic documentation of human torture. The cross-referencing systems embedded in these documents reveal the sophisticated data management underlying these experimental programs. Individual subjects were tracked across multiple experiments, with detailed notes about their responses to different procedures. Physicians could quickly locate information about which subjects had survived particular experiments and what their current condition might be for future research. The international correspondence preserved in these archives shows court physicians sharing experimental data across vast distances. Letters between Dr. al-Dimashqi and his colleagues in other courts contain detailed discussions of experimental techniques, subject management strategies, and comparative analysis of results from different populations. They maintained what amounted to an international database of human experimental research. The translation protocols used for sharing experimental data across language barriers were surprisingly sophisticated. Court physicians developed standardized terminology that could be accurately translated between Arabic, Persian, Turkish, and other languages. They created universal classification systems for experimental procedures that functioned across different cultural and linguistic contexts. The quality control measures applied to experimental documentation were rigorous. Senior physicians regularly audited junior colleagues' record keeping, ensuring consistent standards for data collection and analysis. They maintained formal procedures for correcting errors, updating classifications, and integrating new experimental findings into existing databases. The archival organization systems used for these documents reveal their perceived importance within court administration. Experimental records were cataloged using the same systems applied to diplomatic correspondence and financial accounts. They were stored in climate-controlled chambers and protected by the same security measures used for state secrets. The copying and distribution protocols for experimental documents suggest they were considered crucial educational resources. Multiple copies of important experimental records were maintained, with sets distributed to affiliated courts and medical institutions. The most significant experimental findings were compiled into comprehensive reference works that served as textbooks for training new court physicians. The indexing systems developed for these experimental archives would impress modern librarians. Court scribes created detailed cross-reference guides that allowed researchers to quickly locate specific types of experimental data. They maintained subject indexes, procedure indexes, and outcome indexes that functioned as comprehensive research tools. The damage assessment contained in many of these documents reveals the long-term planning underlying experimental programs. Court physicians didn't just document immediate experimental results, they tracked subjects over months and years, carefully noting the progression of experimental damage and its effects on overall health and functionality. The comparative analysis sections of these documents show court physicians evaluating the effectiveness of different experimental approaches. They maintained detailed statistics comparing the results of various procedures, constantly refining their techniques to maximize data collection while optimizing subject survival for extended research programs. The resource allocation records embedded in these documents reveal the enormous institutional investment in experimental research. Detailed cost accounting shows expenses for specialized equipment, exotic substances, subject acquisition, and facility maintenance. The experimental programs represented significant portions of overall court medical budgets. The personnel management documentation shows the elaborate staffing required for these experimental programs. Court physicians supervised teams of assistants, guards, record keepers, and technicians. The organizational charts preserved in these archives reveal bureaucratic structures as complex as any modern research institution. The safety protocols documented in these archives were designed to protect experimenters rather than subjects. Detailed procedures were maintained for handling dangerous substances, managing violent subjects, and preventing the spread of experimental diseases. The safety of experimental subjects was never a consideration, but the safety of court physicians was meticulously planned. The equipment maintenance records show the sophisticated technology underlying these experimental programs. Court physicians used precision instruments that required regular calibration and repair. They maintained detailed inventories of surgical tools, restraint devices, monitoring equipment, and specimen collection apparatus. The supply chain documentation reveals the international scope of resource acquisition for experimental programs. Exotic substances needed for experiments were imported from across the known world. Specialized equipment was commissioned from master craftsmen. The experimental programs operated with supply networks that spanned continents. The succession planning documented in these archives shows how experimental programs were designed to survive changes in personnel and political leadership. Detailed procedures were maintained for transferring experimental subjects, ongoing research projects, and institutional knowledge from retiring physicians to their successors. The legal documentation surrounding these experimental programs reveals their official status within court administration. Formal contracts were maintained with suppliers, detailed liability agreements were signed with facility operators, and comprehensive insurance policies were purchased to protect against financial losses from experimental failures. The diplomatic correspondence in these archives shows how experimental research influenced international relations. Courts would sometimes share particularly valuable experimental subjects as diplomatic gifts. Successful experimental techniques were traded as state secrets. The experimental programs became tools of cultural and technological diplomacy between allied empires. The educational documentation reveals how these experimental programs were integrated into formal medical training. Detailed curricula were maintained for teaching experimental techniques to new physicians. Standardized examinations tested students' knowledge of experimental procedures. Academic advancement required demonstrated competence in experimental research methods. The peer-reviewed documentation shows the scholarly standards applied to experimental research. Court physicians regularly evaluated each other's experimental designs, methodologies, and conclusions. They maintained formal procedures for critiquing research methods and improving experimental techniques through collaborative review. The publication records reveal how experimental findings were disseminated within the court physician community. Formal treatises were written, summarizing important experimental discoveries. Academic conferences were held where physicians presented their research findings. Scholarly journals were maintained that published the most significant experimental results. The institutional memory preservation systems documented in these archives were designed to maintain experimental knowledge across generations. Formal apprenticeship programs ensured knowledge transfer from senior to junior physicians. Comprehensive libraries were maintained containing centuries of accumulated experimental research. Oral tradition protocols were established to preserve experimental techniques that couldn't be adequately documented in writing. The modernization records show how experimental programs adapted to incorporate new technologies and techniques. Court physicians regularly updated their experimental methods based on advances in instrumentation, new chemical discoveries, and improved understanding of human anatomy. The experimental programs were dynamic systems that evolved continuously over time. What emerges from this documentary evidence is a picture of systematic human experimentation that operated with the efficiency and sophistication of modern research institutions, but without any of the ethical constraints that govern contemporary medical research. These weren't primitive torture sessions conducted by ignorant barbarians. These were carefully planned, meticulously documented, scientifically sophisticated research programs that happened to use human beings as disposable laboratory equipment. The preservation of these documents through centuries of political upheaval suggests they were considered valuable institutional assets rather than embarrassing evidence of criminal activity. The care taken in maintaining these archives indicates that court physicians expected their experimental research to be studied and continued by future generations of medical practitioners. The international scope of documentation preservation reveals a coordinated effort to maintain institutional memory across different empires and cultures. Similar archive systems were maintained from Istanbul to Delhi, suggesting formal protocols for preserving experimental knowledge that transcended individual courts or political boundaries. The tragic irony embedded in these documents is that they represent some of the most careful scientific documentation of their era, applied to research programs that violated every principle of human dignity. The same attention to detail and methodological rigor that could have advanced legitimate medical knowledge was instead used to systematize and optimize human torture. These documents stand as monuments to the capacity of sophisticated institutions to normalize and systematize the most horrific forms of human cruelty. They remind us that careful documentation, scientific methodology, and institutional legitimacy can be applied to evil purposes just as easily as to beneficial ones. The horror lies not just in what these court physicians did, but in how completely normal and scientifically respectable they made it appear. The women who suffered and died in these experimental programs left no documents of their own. Their voices were silenced, their experiences reduced to clinical observations in their torturers' notebooks. The only record of their existence consists of experimental data recorded by the very people who killed them. They became footnotes in medical history written by the physicians who denied their humanity. We remember them not through their own words, but through the meticulous documentation of their suffering preserved in archives that their killers maintained as proof of scientific achievement. Their legacy exists in the form of experimental records that their torturers believed would contribute to medical progress, but which instead stand as evidence of how completely medical science can be corrupted when it abandons its fundamental commitment to human dignity. The court physicians who conducted these experiments saw themselves as pioneers of medical knowledge, advancing human understanding through rigorous scientific research. They believed their careful documentation would be studied by future generations of medical practitioners who would build upon their discoveries to save countless lives. Instead, their records serve as warnings about what happens when scientific curiosity is divorced from moral responsibility. These documents force us to confront uncomfortable questions about the relationship between knowledge and ethics, between scientific progress and human dignity. They remind us that the capacity for systematic cruelty exists within the same intellectual traditions that have produced our greatest medical advances. The line between healing and horror can be crossed by respected institutions following seemingly legitimate scientific methods. The legacy of these experimental programs extends far beyond the palace chambers where they were conducted. The knowledge gained through systematic torture influenced medical practices that continued for centuries. The institutional attitudes that enabled experimental abuse shaped broader cultural understanding of who deserved protection and who could be sacrificed for the greater good. Understanding this history doesn't diminish the achievements of legitimate medical research, but it does remind us why ethical constraints on scientific inquiry exist. The court physicians who tortured women in the name of medical advancement weren't betraying scientific principles. They were following scientific methods while ignoring the moral foundations that should guide all human research. Their carefully preserved documentation stands as testimony to both the heights of scientific sophistication and the depths of moral corruption that can coexist within the same institutions. These archives remind us that progress without ethics isn't progress at all. It's simply the systematic application of knowledge to illegitimate ends. The women who died in these experimental chambers deserved better than to be remembered only through their torturers' clinical notes. But since those notes are all that remain, we honor their memory by ensuring that their suffering serves as a permanent warning about the dangers of scientific inquiry divorced from fundamental human dignity. Their deaths were not contributions to medical progress, but tragic reminders of what happens when healing becomes horror.